attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hi everyone, this is Andy Steele, and I'm back again for yet another show, and this is going to be a really important one today that you are not going to want to miss. I'm going to be interviewing Tony Rooke, and if anyone doesn't know who he is the documentary filmmaker who refused to pay his BBC license fee because of its support of terrorism. Namely, its propaganda attacks on the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence to keep the 9/11 lie unchallenged in the public's consciousness. So we're going to be going over the case and the aftermath of what happened last Monday, and we're going to discuss where to go from there, so stay tuned for that. Now, if this is the first episode of 9/11 Freefall you've ever heard, what the show does is it talks about 9/11 truth, 9/11 science truth, and we focus attention on people doing what they can to bring the big lie crashing down. And of course, the lie I'm speaking about is the fable of the U.S. government's official story of why the Twin Towers and Building 7 were destroyed. Politicians and the media have enabled and they have participated in the cover-up of the scientifically demonstrable fact that those buildings were brought down in a pre-planned controlled demolition. The case has been made and this fact has been proven, but our nation and our world is being held hostage by people who, for whatever reason, and we won't speculate on it now in the show, but for whatever reason, have a vested interest in keeping the evidence suppressed. So this show is a part of a worldwide resistance that is fighting back to restore law and order, and which is growing bigger every single day, exposing this evidence and putting it in the record who were the heroes, who were the cowards, and who were the criminals complicit in the covering up of this crime. And I, for one, believe that the perpetrators will be brought to justice. And when they are, as our guest last week, Dale Pierce, said, a lot of people are going to have a bitter pill to swallow. Now, a group leading the way in this resistance and bringing the truth to light is Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. This is a nonprofit organization currently representing over 1,700 verified architects and engineers who have tirelessly dedicated a portion of their lives to informing the public of the real 9/11 crime. All right, they've been making movies, giving lectures, and reaching out to different groups of people to let them know what they can do to free America from a deception that continues to mutilate its national destiny. The people at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth are the true patriots, and they represent the real spirit of America. All right, and you can be a part of that group by going to ae911truth.org and clicking the volunteer tab on the right-hand side and seeing which team you can lend your talents to. All right, whether you're a writer or you're a talker or you're a planner, you got something you can add to this important fight, and you are needed, okay? Not just by AE, but by your country, too. And I'm not kidding when I say that, folks, okay? People died on 9/11 when somebody decided to give the order to bring those buildings down on their heads. Okay, 9/11 is being used to set a blowtorch to the U.S. Constitution and to needlessly put our good men and women in the military in harm's way to act as the hired muscle for an empire that truly cares nothing about them. Okay, so your future descendants are relying on you to make this a better world. You need to go to ae911truth.org and bring what you have to the table to join in this worldwide fight. All right, now, before we get to our guest, what we're going to do is what we do every week. We are going to take about 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families, and everyone who has died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to do that right now. Okay, and that is 10 seconds. Our guest is Tony Rooke. Tony Rooke has been studying 9/11 and related matter for about 8 years now, and he recently made a documentary on UK intelligence analyst Tony Farrell called Offensive, the story of Tony Farrell. And Tony Rooke is the man behind the BBC license fee court case we talked about last week and earlier on the show. Tony, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Hi, Andy. Nice to talk to you.
Oh, it's nice to have you on, and thank you for coming on at such short notice and for all the work you're doing. Now, we're going to start like we always do, because our audience wants to know, and I want to know. Tell us your story. How did you wake up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, and what prompted you to take action?
I think the first movie I ever saw on 9/11 related matters was by an American guy called Mike Rupert. You may be aware of him, and he was talking about the CIA and the various sort of skullduggery they were getting up to. My father happens to be a retired police officer. He was a forensic detective, and I showed him this particular picture. And then I got hold of a copy of Loose Change, like half the world has done, showed him some of that, and I said, "What do you think, Dad?" He said, "There's something wrong here, there's something wrong." And I just started studying everything I could on the subject, really. And around about 2009, it occurred to me that, well, if these were inside jobs, and I'm not just talking about 9/11 as well, because, of course, we had our own 9/11 in England with 7/7, these things have to be financed. And obviously, if it's an inside job, then they're using our money. So I thought, well, that there has to be some legislation to forbid the funding of this kind of crap. So I looked up something called the Terrorism Act 2000 in the UK, and sure enough, there in Section 15, Article 3, it says if you have reasonable cause to believe you may be, it's quite a broad piece of legislation, you may be funding the purposes of terrorism, then you don't pay. So I sort of took a gamble, and initially in 2009, I did write to a few people. I wrote to Tim Spark, who I think was one of the producers on Loose Change Final Cut, and Tim was working at the BBC of all places at the time I wrote to him, and he said, "I'd love to help you, but I'm in a slightly invidious position here. I'm trying to sort of do some good from the inside." And then I kind of let it drift and studied more, and eventually I thought, well, what the hell, I'm going to go to my local police station. And I was kind of fortunate because I live in a small town called Chichester it's a city actually, because we have a cathedral, in Sussex, which is down by the south coast in England, about 60 miles south of London. And trotted in there with some evidence under my arm, and the guy behind the front desk happened to be an old colleague of my father. He'd sort of retired and taken up a civilian job there, and I told him why I was there, and you get the usual looks, don't you, when you start talking about this thing. And he said, "Well, what's your name?" I said, "Tony Rooke." He said, "Are you related to Eddie Rooke?" And I said, "Yeah, he's my father." He said, "What does he think about it?" I said, "Well, yeah, he's on board. He thinks it stinks." So he said, "Well, that's good enough for me," and then got this very glamorous lady police officer down to talk to me, who, again, looked at me as if I was off another planet. She took no notes at all, but I then followed it up by bringing in some hard copy evidence, got receipts, etc., sent her an email, said, "What are you doing with this stuff?" And she said, "Well, I've passed it on to divisional intelligence due to the nature of it," and I believe she has. I've since learned that there's a paper trail, I quote, "as long as your arm." So I assume that they're investigating it. And then, of course, we have a thing here, Andy, called the television license fee. The British Broadcasting Company, we have to fund. It's about £145 a year. So I thought, well, excuse my French, but bugger this, I'm not paying for that, because I knew for a fact that they'd been covering up 9/11. They never told us about the NIST report and World Trade Center 7 going into free fall for 8 stories. So I thought, I'm not paying it. And I wrote to them. Some years ago, I wrote to them and said, I'm not paying you. This is not on. And until you can tell me the original source for that story. I don't mean Reuters, by the way. That's just a press agency. The original source, where did it come from? And then, of course, the BBC famously, I think like CNN, broadcast the story well before it happened, 23 minutes, I think, over here. And they still, to this day, have not told us where this story came from. Like yourself, I'm sure, and your listeners are all aware of people like Craig Bartmer, who was the police officer nearby, who heard about, heard the explosions, etc. So anyway, I wrote to the BBC, the police, the Home Office, the Crown Prosecution Service, which were an organisation in England that the arbiters of whether a case is good enough to go to court or not, and they just sort of fobbed me off, really. And then one day, last year, I think it was, a guy knocked on my door and he said, "Excuse me, do you have a TV license?" I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, I'm not paying it under Section 15, Article 3 of the Terrorism Act." And he looked at me as if I was mad. And to cut a long story short, it ended up in a court case last Monday in a small town called Horsham, which is just south of Gatwick Airport, which is one of London's airports. And we went in. We weren't allowed to present the evidence that I had, and I had some very good witnesses lined up. Professor Niels Harrit, you may be aware of, who did some of the original studies on the thermitic material found in the dust from the World Trade Centers. Tony Farrell, former principal intelligence officer from South Yorkshire Police here in England. Ray Savage, former counter-terrorism officer, now retired. Peter Drew, who's the UK coordinator for architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Who else am I leaving out? Adrian Mallet, former firefighter, qualified civil engineer. Ian Henschel, who's written two of the best-selling books on 9/11 in the UK, sold tens of thousands of copies. But due to the level of the judiciary that we were working under, the judge said we couldn't present the evidence. Having said that, Andy, the judge had seen it all. I submitted an hour-long video. All the witnesses have to make statements about what they're going to say. We had letters from Richard Gage, Dwayne Dietz, people, some really sort of respectable figures, pilots from 9/11 Truth, etc. So the judge has seen it all, but ultimately came to the decision that because of the level of court we were at, we couldn't present the evidence. That said, even the prosecutor, I won't name because it would be unfair on him, they had what we call a whip round in England, and we had 150 people turn up. Some people turned up from as far away as Norway, and I was not fined a penny. I was made to pay £200 court costs, which is pretty low, if not the lowest. And even the prosecutor put a quid in the pot towards my towards my court costs. So, but I won't name him because he's a charming chap, and I wouldn't want to put him in trouble. But it was a great day and a moral victory. And there's certainly one very educated judge in this country now.
That is amazing, and I love your story, and I want to kind of go back and dissect it a little bit, because this is a big deal. It's they say it's a small but significant step, and it reminds me, we have this story here in the United States of someone named Rosa Parks who refused to get up. She was a black woman who refused to give up her bus seat, and and I don't know a lot of details about the Rosa Parks story and how much of it was pre-planned and how much of it was just a spontaneous thing. We grew up and were told that she just suddenly didn't want to give up her seat, and it became a big protest sparked out of nothing. So how much planning did you put into not wanting to pay this license fee? Was it something that you kind of came up with casually, or was it something that you just said to yourself, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and you got yourself mentally ready? Because obviously, there's trouble associated with doing that. They can threaten you, and there's penalties associated. That's why you had to go to court. So was it something you decided to do kind of on the spot, or was it something that you had thought, okay, I'm going to do this, and we're going to see what happens?
Yeah, well, I considered the idea, once I'd found the legislation, once I'd realized that I was funding, anybody who, pays tax, same in the US, when you buy a car, or you buy I smoke, I drink, you pay tax, and it all goes towards these illegal wars. Even our Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg in the UK, has said that the war in Iraq is illegal. So I'm thinking, well, I'm funding terrorism. There's a great guy in England called Chris Coverdale, who's really been protesting a long time about international war law. He's not a lawyer like me, but he studied it pretty thoroughly. And he kind of sort of gave me the idea of not using the war law, but I found in the Terrorism Act this law that you don't pay, and that, like I said, that was around about 2009, and I'd written to Tim Spark, who'd worked on Loose Change and things like that, and I didn't really get a huge response on it, and so I kind of thought, well, and I left it for a little bit, but when I decided to to go to the police station, that's when it really kind of hit home. I thought, well, I've taken this step now. I was a little bit nervous, and then in once I'd got the court date, and I actually went, and I'd rang Tony Farrell, who's now a friend of mine, the intelligence officer from South Yorkshire, because I went up and stayed with him for a week or so and made a film on him. Can I plug that? It's called Offensive: The Story of Tony Farrell. I think you've done.
Absolutely.
I think you've done that on YouTube. And Tony's a wonderfully brave man. And I thought, well, once I got the court date, a few of us came down for the pre-trial, which is really you just put your case forward, they put their case forward. They try and frighten you a little bit into just saying, okay, I'll pay the license fee. But we have a thing here called the European Court of Human Rights Act, and it's Article 6 of that. If you're accused of a criminal offence, which, believe it or not having a TV license it's a crime. I said, well, I have the right to defend myself, so I will. And then the judge said to me, it was quite funny, he said, well, how long do you think this case will last, Mr. Rooke? And I said, well, and I thought about it. I said, well, at least 2 years. But he said, no, I'll give you 3 hours. I thought, oh, shit, here we go. So, well, 3 hours is better than nothing, And in recent months, I was getting a little bit twitchy because you read about things. I can't remember the name of the lady in was it Florida, who was a madam, and she was found hanging in her garage or something like that.
Right.
But I'm a Christian, so I'm mad enough to believe that the good Lord watches over me, and so I did write. So I did take the precaution of writing to the Prime Minister, David Cameron, and said what I was doing, and I put a little footnote at the end of the letter saying that I'm of sound health and mind, and I live in a very low crime area. I'm not prone to suicide, etc. And a letter to the BBC as well. There's a guy called Richard Porter, who was really sort of responsible for putting out this crap about the BBC. It was a cock-up that they broadcast the demise of Building 7 23 minutes before it occurred. So yeah, it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but in recent months it's taken on a life of its own, really, which of course the internet is responsible. People like yourself, it gets circulated, and I managed to get hold of Niels Harrit, who's a very respected guy, a very bright boy, and people sort of came forward to help and said, yeah, we want to sort of be part of this. And so when we come the day, I was a bit nervous, but a large scotch and a bit of diazepam does wonders.
Well, that's good advice, and that's advice to live by. But, what you're doing kind of parallels with what we're trying to do at AE 9/11 Truth right now. We're trying to get people to visit their police stations, their local police chiefs, their sheriffs, to talk about this evidence. And in the rationale is that you go to the roots of, well, in our case, American justice, in your case, British justice, but of justice, of national justice, because those are the enforcers of law and order in every country, and they are ultimately the people that would have to deal with something else if it God forbid it ever happened. And so you want to plant the seed, and you're doing a great job of that. You've planted the seed in so many different people's minds. The police, the lady who came down and spoke to you, the judges, the prosecutors. And so what you've done is that you went about it the right way. It wasn't even that you did some kind of angry, violent protest or anything like that. You are using the system to go after the real terrorists, and you are absolutely right on the money when you cite the Terrorism Act, because that is what you are doing when you fund BBC. I don't care if nobody at BBC was involved in the planning, but they are complicit in covering it up. And the fact that they reported that Building 7 had already fallen, an event that should not have happened. Okay, this was the first time ever a steel-framed high-rise had ever completely collapsed because of a fire. And Jane Stanley is standing there right in front of the building. It's still right there behind her. And as Richard Gage says in Blueprint for Truth, they cite the confusion of the day, but does that make them psychic? How do you predict an event that's never happened before?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the fact that not only did they report that, but they didn't investigate their own reporting of that. Because I would understand to an extent if somebody passed that along and they ran with it and she doesn't know what Building 7 looks like, she's just reporting it. But once you know you've reported this 20 minutes earlier, they have a duty to look into their records, to look and investigate themselves and say, well, how did we get that information? And to be the real fourth branch of government, the fourth estate of the world, of your country, and do it for our country too. But to do their job, to be journalists, and they're not doing that, and they're using their platform, they're using taxpayer money to be a mouthpiece for a Western establishment that is, using 9/11 to attack the world, that is using it to enslave it. And so, no, you are absolutely right, and you did this the perfect way, and this is something that I want people to see. I want them to learn from your example and follow in your footsteps. Now, you talked a little bit about the outcome of the case. So you weren't allowed to present the evidence in this case. So, what was the official verdict? That they dropped the charges against you, right?
Yeah, it's. I'm trying to find a similar analogy. I mean, we have something here called strict liability. A television license, like your income tax, is a strict liability. There's effectively no defense against it. Obviously, I would argue there is a defense against it because you're funding terrorism. The result was, Andy, that the judge had seen the evidence, although it wasn't aired in court. It would have been aired to, really. We were preaching to the converted because the courtroom was packed with 9/11 truthers. I don't think there were any members of the unknowing public, if you like, but the judge could have fined me. You can be fined up to £1,000 for not having a TV license. The judge fined me absolutely zero, gave me the lowest court costs, and gave me what's called a 6-month conditional discharge, which means for 6 months I have to behave like the model citizen, and otherwise, if I'm taken back to court for anything, then this issue comes up again, and they can sort of pile it on top. I'm expected to go out and buy a TV license, of course, which is not going to happen. And so, yeah, it was a very, very gentle slap on the wrist. A very gentle slap on the wrist. But there is that's the irony of it, the craziness of it. And there was about 10 minutes in the courtroom where it was like legal ping pong, where the prosecutor was saying, well, there is no defense, and he'd laid up. They've never lost a case. They have never, ever lost a case. But then again, it's like playing tennis, when you've got a tennis racket and the other guy hasn't, because the law is just loaded against you. But I did point out to the judge, this is a conflict of law, sir, and you have to be very polite. You have to play the game, get suited and booted, look smart. And I was very genuine and very passionate, and I don't know if you're aware of the Jimmy Savile situation in England at the moment with the BBC.
No, go ahead and describe that.
Well, okay, it's big news. We had I'm trying to think what might be similar. I don't want to besmirch the guy who plays Pee Wee Herman, but when I lived in the States, you had a guy called Pee Wee Herman. He did this kind of kid show kind of stuff, and I'm sure he's a very nice man. And I'm not comparing him to Jimmy Savile, but Jimmy Savile did a similar kind of thing back in the 70s and 80s, and he did a TV show called Jim Will Fix It. And you would write in letters and you say, like, I want to meet my favourite footballer or my favourite rock star or whatever. And the BBC, with Jimmy Savile as a frontman, would arrange it. And that was the show. It was a half-hour show on Saturday night. It was top-rated. Everyone loved it. And Jimmy Savile was a very popular guy. He was a very odd-looking man. He used to wear sort of gold sort of lame tracksuits and a long sort of blonde. He was a strange chap, but he was kind of this avuncular figure, and people loved him. Did lots of work for charity. But it has since emerged that he is probably the most prolific paedophile this country's ever produced, and had good relationships with the royal family, good relationships with the police, was even allowed to live on the premises of Broadmoor Hospital, which is a forensic hospital for the criminally insane. We've got some of the worst serial killers in the country there, and he was allowed to live there, and apparently was committing serious sexual offences in the hospital on these people who are desperately ill. Hundreds of cases have since come forward. There's been some suicides of children who are abused by him. And the BBC knew about this. They had an awful lot of information on this. The police were notified about it, but they sat on the story. They sat on the story to the degree that rather than air it or pursue it, they actually put out a tribute program to this man after his death. And then it was actually ITV, who are the independent, if you like, opposition channel to the BBC in the UK, the second biggest channel. And I mean, it's a huge thing now. I mean, Jimmy Savile is this sort of, vilified figure of evil now, and the BBC were covering it up. So it was probably not a bad time to go to court and have a pop against the BBC. And when I was in the courtroom last Monday, I did lose my rag a little bit. I did get a little bit angry and said to the judge, with the greatest respect, sir, look, I've been asked to pay for the cover-up of 9/11, which we can prove incontrovertibly that Building 7 was demolished. I'm being asked to pay for the cover-up of a paedophile ring at the BBC. I'm being asked to pay for an illegal war in Iraq and Afghanistan. What more do you want me to pay for? There is such a thing as morality here. You've just asked me to swear on the Bible. I'm a Christian. This is getting stupid, sir. And thankfully, I think he was a decent guy, hence no fine. So that was satisfying. That was gratifying to be able to do that. But the BBC have got a lot to answer for at the moment here.
Oh, I'm getting goosebumps listening to you tell the story, and I think those words should echo throughout history because they are so appropriate and they are so correct. And this is the first I'm hearing about this pedophile celebrity guy, but this just goes to show how the BBC is, complicit in crimes. And this is related to 9/11 because people think, they wouldn't be complicit in covering up that, even though there's so many people that have something to lose from that. High up people who will lose money. But they would cover up, but they've proven that they would cover up something as big as this person who's molesting all of these children. And, what are they going to say to all those children? Are they going to call them conspiracy theorists? Are they going to, anybody that comes out against this guy, are they going to attack them like they would attack a 9/11 Truth activist? Now, I haven't heard, I don't know if they have or not.
Well, they've already started to redact the evidence. We know that was even in one of the mainstream newspapers. They started to redact the report on it. I mean, a couple of the kids committed suicide, very sadly. But I worked at the BBC in the 1980s when we were at war with the Falkland Islands. I was just a pen pusher. I had a very lowly job. I was doing catering invoices for programs like Doctor Who in the drama department. I wasn't aware of the Jimmy Savile thing, but I did have a friend of mine who was working in the news department, and he was telling me stuff about what the British troops were doing to these young Argentinian conscripts who were only like 16, 17 years old, who once they'd been shot, where they were, removing their genitalia as souvenirs and all this kind of stuff, which unfortunately happens in war. And I'm not saying it's an indigenous thing with the British or the Americans or anybody. I mean, war is a horrible thing and people do horrible things. But the BBC buried it, and it's since come out in the 90s, and that was, that's propaganda by silence. It sins by omission. Mm-hmm. So
well, it is, and it's and this is the first time. I always knew that BBC was a state-sponsored network. I never knew exactly how it worked, and it just seems like an extra insult that you guys actually have to pay a special fee, a licensing fee, and a guy actually comes to your door and collects it, so that you can pay for your own propaganda.
Yeah.
And again, like I said last week in describing this to the audience, in return, BBC is expected to act like a real journalistic broadcasting company and report things fairly. You would expect that for something something that is funded by the people. And I guess I always knew taxpayer money went towards it, but the fact that you're actually paying for it specifically just seems to add insult to injury. And then they're using your own money to attack you, to attack people like you, to attack people that are telling the truth and pointing to known liars and pointing to people who don't deserve the benefit of the doubt and calling them on their lies, where the science proves the lie. It's irrefutable. And yet the BBC is using your own money to try to cover up reality, to reshape what is universal scientific truths for political agendas, and it's sickening.
Oh, absolutely. I can't disagree with a syllable of that. It is absolutely sickening, and like I said, I mean, what we're doing now with the guys from Architects and Engineers. And other guys in this country, when Niels Harrit, what we need to do now is to move the case forward. I'm very, very reluctant to go to appeal or judicial review, which we do have that option, because I'll be divorced apart from anything else. But we need a really rich guy or we need a really poor guy. That's the strange thing about it. If we have a bankrupt guy, they can then go forward and the court has to pay the costs, really, or a very wealthy person who's not worried about all the huge legal fees that the BBC will bring with them. So that's the next step with this case. But yeah, I mean, you're quite right. It's literally criminal that we have to do this, that we have to fund this crap, and I suppose I just got that fed up with it. I thought, well, nobody else is going to do it. I'll do it, and hopefully other people will copy it. And I did an interview earlier today with one of your guys in the States, and you must have similar legislation there, Andy. You must have legislation that forbids you from funding terrorism. So just bung up the courts. Just flood the courts, and see what happens, because you're not breaking the law, you're obeying the law.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing I always stress on this show, is we need to get past this idea that we're somehow troublemakers, causing problems and stirring up issues that don't exist. We're actually on the side of law and order. The case has been proven. It's not a theory, it's a fact. They brought those towers down with in a controlled demolition. Mm-hmm. The nanothermitic material has been found in the World Trade Center powder. It's open and shut, okay? It's just a matter of getting by this occupation that we're living under and getting this evidence into the general public's mind and getting past this normalcy bias that's been placed in everybody's brains by this well-funded, well-established system that we were all born into, that just says, not my country, not here in the West, where we're above such things, when we really obviously we're not, given the situation that we see playing out in front of us. Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about the experts you were going to bring before the magistrate, and it didn't happen. What would you consider to be the strongest evidence? If there's anything that could be the bullseye centerpiece of your case, what would you consider it to be?
Isaac Newton. Yeah. I mean, that's the easiest thing, I think, for people to understand, because it is high school physics, and it can be demonstrated very easily in front of a judge with a pool ball or a billiard ball. And that was Niels, who was going to do a 45-minute PowerPoint presentation on that. Obviously, you've got the BBC prescient report by 23 minutes. You've got them not telling the British public about the NIST report, which actually admits the free fall. There's so much stuff, that. There is so much stuff. But if I had to stick with one, I'd just say, well, prove Newton wrong. He's been right for 300 years. I mean, however long it is. That would be the one that we go with. But what we really need to do is get it to a stage. I don't know if I mentioned April Gallup. I'm sure you'll be familiar with her case. That this wonderful lady who had the guts to stand up to Cheney, Rumsfeld, Myers, whoever it was, at the Pentagon case, and then gets confronted by George Bush's cousin when she gets to court. And if that's not an abusive process, I don't know what is. I was actually going to ask the judge, just as a moment of dark humor, if he was related to G.W. Bush, but I never had the opportunity, unfortunately. But Isaac Newton, you can't get around that one.
Well, no, you can, and Richard Gage makes the case in 2 hours, and so if you'd even wanted to rely just on that, you still would have had an hour left over to drink coffee. I mean, it's so simple, and that's really just how I guess the parody of the whole situation is that I don't consider myself to be some kind of super genius here, but I can understand, and I can watch that building fall and just tell you, based on instinct and having some common sense, that fire didn't cause Building 7 to fall. And I have the intellectual honesty to admit it, and I don't think of my government as somehow reflecting on me in some way, so I have no problem pointing a finger when I think they've committed a crime. But where you don't get past this, and that's the problem, and not just in this country, it's in Europe, it's everywhere, because I've seen this even in Eastern countries too, is that people think my country, right or wrong, it can't be wrong, what they say is gospel, and there's always people that stand out in every place, but I'm talking about the majority, and this is why things don't change. Now I want to ask you, I understand what the BBC's position is, which really I don't, you can't blame pigs for oinking, they are what they are, but in the UK, just the general public that you talk to on the street, free of the peer pressure and propaganda, what is the overwhelming attitude towards the issue of 9/11 truth and the controlled demolition of the towers there?
It's very strange. I have a little term. I call it the Father Christmas syndrome. I think most people who know me, because they have no choice, because they get bombarded with it. Since the case, and I've been splashed all over my front of my local paper, it only has a circulation of 30,000, and who I am thinking of suing because it says TV license dodger, which I haven't dodged it at all. I've made it very open that I haven't had a license for some time and told everybody, including the BBC. But a lot of people have been coming up to me and saying, well done for standing up what you believe in. I think the zeitgeist here is that most people think there's something wrong, but like the Father Christmas syndrome, nobody wants to be told that he doesn't exist. It's a childlike psychology. Do you know what I mean? It's they know that they lied about the WMDs. They know that they lied about the war in Iraq. They know that politicians are dishonest. I think we've had polls in this country where politicians rate lower on trust than second-hand car salesmen. There is a genuine feeling that these people are crooked, but it's kind of accepted. It's the way it is. I think 9/11, the London bombings. Funnily enough, I think 9/11 is probably more prevalent in this country. People are more suspicious of it, but because it's over there. It's your guys. It's your guys. We can blame you guys for being evil and wicked, but the British aren't evil and wicked, which is ridiculous when you look at the history of the British Empire, of course, and then you study 7/7. People find it a lot easier to believe, and I found it in discussions with people, they're far more ready to believe that 9/11 was an inside job than London. Whether London was done with any more finesse, I don't think so. When you actually look at it, it's ridiculous. There's no photographs of the guys on the tube trains. London's one of the most CCTV covered cities in the world. We know that MI6 were all over these guys months before they said they were. People know there's something wrong, Andy, but they don't want to believe it. Do you know what I mean? They don't want to believe that. If somebody, I'm a Christian, if somebody turned around to me and said, we've proved Jesus didn't exist, I wouldn't want to believe it. I'd fight it, heart and soul. And nobody has, by the way, but it is the Father Christmas syndrome. I think people in England are very suspicious of 9/11. I mean, I know for a fact when they put out programs like the Conspiracy Files and they which were featured in the video evidence, which unfortunately I can't put up on the internet for legal reasons, because I want to use it again, or certainly give it to someone else to use again, that all the comments that were put up on the BBC's page and in the newspapers were, by and large, what a pile of crap that was. If you believe this nonsense, you'll believe anything. So there is a groundswell of opinion that there is something very wrong, but people are scared. They are scared. I mean, we had a guy over here called David Kelly. I don't know if you were familiar with him. He was the weapons of mass destruction guy. who was, I think it was on Sky News. You know, he said, "Oh, I'm going to be found dead in the woods," and he was. He was found dead in the woods. So there is a fear of government. There is it's almost like the Stasi, the Gestapo, the old dark days, and people have kind of accepted it. It's evil by increments, and then they've done it very cleverly. They've done it very slowly. But I think 9/11, to quote J. Edgar Hoover, and I think he was talking about communism when he was referring to this, said, the individual is handicapped by a conspiracy so big, he cannot believe it to be true. He cannot believe it. It's so big. Hitler said it, tell a lie, tell a big one. Just keep repeating it and they'll go for it in the end. But people are suspicious.
Well, and you talk about the conspiracy being so big, and I guess what's so creepy about it is, okay, obviously, anybody who is intellectually honest and studies the evidence will see that those buildings had to have been blown up. But what's so creepy about it is that the BBC is covering up for what should be considered an American crime. And I think people see that. And I understand the sentiment that, okay, you can believe 9/11 more so because it's not your own country. And we here in America may not want to believe it because it is our own country and it's our problem. And we don't really want to deal with the problem like that. We don't really know how to deal with the problem. We're dealing with it the best way we know how. I am, you are. And, if anybody's got any better suggestions, please send them our way. But what's freaky about it is, people will sit back and say, well, yeah, it's obvious the BBC is covering up for this, but why is the BBC, which is supposed to be a British national television station, covering up for what is an American crime? And Britain was affected by 9/11, obviously, too, and you guys were drawn into our wars that followed 9/11 as well, and so you guys have been affected by this just as we have. I think if people look at it's almost looking at it like a horribly trashed, messy room and not knowing where to start. So you end up just sitting down and watching television because you just, the job is so big. And I think the fact that conspiracy is so big, and it's on so many fronts, I think it just paralyzes people into inaction. And that's what we're up against.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the BBC covering up for what you term an American crime, I mean, I can perfectly understand that. I'm sure there are some people making some huge amounts of money somewhere along the line. There's an interesting thing that we were going to bring up in court, which is open knowledge. I'm not telling any tales here. In the BBC Charter, they have a royal charter, and they also have editorial guidelines to which they're meant to adhere. In the event of emergency, and boy, if 9/11 wasn't an emergency, I don't know what was, the BBC comes under the control of Whitehall, which is, our government. So that's written down. That we know that for a fact. And so I think what happened, the chain of events, and this is purely my opinion, this is speculation. The World Trade Center 7 went down. The script obviously got put out early. They knew it was going to go down. My personal opinion is it was meant to go down much earlier in the day. I could be wrong on that. But anyway, they made a balls up on the script. It went out. And then someone got hold of the BBC and said, listen, get rid of those tapes, which did happen. They lost the tapes. They then found them again. And they've been backpedaling ever since on this story. I mean, I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the BBC a long, long time ago and said, could you please tell me where this story came from? And they didn't tell me. And the irony is that the Freedom of Information Act protects the BBC from telling you. That's how useful it is. But an interesting thing is, a shameless plug here. If you watch, actually no, I can't because that's my court evidence. I'll wheedle it into something else. But if you actually watch 9/11, I think it's 9/11 Conspiracy Road Trip. It might be Conspiracy Files on 9/11. There is a clip of Richard Porter, who was in charge of news at the time, and he was asked. I think it was the 10th anniversary program. He was asked where they got the story from of 9/11, of World Trade Center 7 going down early, which obviously they reported 23 minutes early. in that clip, he has an email on his desk which he is reading from. And if you zoom in on it, freeze it, blow it up, it would appear that the request is made to Reuters, a news agency, and says something to the effect of, we want to put this thing to bed. What can we say? And Reuters then say, you have permission to attribute to us that this report is from Reuters and it was a mistake. Now this is 10 years later. They still haven't told us where the original source of the story came from. Who told them? Reuters is just a news provider. That is not the original source of the story. They could have gone to Craig Bartmer. Craig Bartmer would have told them there was explosions going off everywhere. And he was a police officer. He's a pretty reliable witness. And I'm sure, who's the other guys at Andy McPadden? No, they won't. They just say it was Reuters. And the BBC seem to have made very little effort to ascertain the original source of that story. Something was very strange. Something very strange was happening that day, Andy, with the BBC. And I do believe they came under the control of Whitehall.
Well, it's funny, too, because they lost the feed right before the building actually did fall right behind Jane, because they didn't want to have it falling down there as she's, the Jane Stanley who was reporting it, they didn't want it actually falling down while she's standing there, so they lose the feed.
Yeah, they said it was on a timer, I don't know.
Yeah, but the thing is that it doesn't come from Reuters, it comes from somebody. Somebody on the street has to say the building has collapsed. And tell that to Reuters to pass on to the BBC, and that's really what the source is. And people watch this and they see people like you, reasonable people, asking reasonable questions, and they see them being stonewalled over the answers that should be pretty simple. They should be able to cite their sources. That's journalism 101. It's not a secret thing. I mean, the building did eventually fall down. Who told you that it fell down? Who gave that report in? Who phoned that in? And they can't even say that. And so if people are not suspicious, then they're not using their brains, or they're just being fearful and they're ignoring it. And it takes people like you to draw this out and to make a big deal out of it, to draw attention to the fact that there is a major problem here, and to not move on like the media wants us to. You see this in our media all the time now, how we need to move on from 9/11. It's in the past. Don't look at it. Don't think about it anymore, because their whole story is falling apart, so they want us to just move on and just leave it like an abandoned car, on the interstate. But we're not going to do that. We're going to keep moving forward. Now, what do the audience is listening to this, and they're looking at you as somebody as an example of what to do. What do you tell the audience to do? I mean, first to your fellow citizens in England, should they be paying their BBC license fee? Would you encourage them to do the same thing that you're doing?
Yeah, well, yeah, I would. I would. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of Building 7 on the internet, that's for sure. I mean, make your own little compilation film of Building 7. Collect what evidence you can. Print off the Terrorism Act, or certainly the section you need to, which is Section 15, Article 3. You can use, or they can use, my case, certainly in this country. I don't know how it affects the jurisdiction in America or the legislation in America. Say a judge has looked at this guy has not been fined, he's not been convicted, he's been given a conditional discharge. And bearing in mind, I mean, some people have gone to court with some pretty strange things over the years and do get punished quite heavily for what they call vexatious and frivolous litigation. That was not the case with this stuff. That was not the case at all. It was taken seriously. Bearing in mind, we had a chief intelligence analyst as a witness. We had an ex-counter-terrorism officer as a witness. We had a chemistry professor. Go to the police. They're not all bad guys, They're nice people. I don't know how many police officers died on 9/11 in New York. I think it was 30 or so. You'll probably know better than me. They have children. They could have died that day. The same on the underground in London. The police, they could have lost kids. Soldiers, I live quite near an army recruitment centre, and I've been over there and given them copies of my film. Just go to these people, because they're the ones who are going to change it ultimately. We've got to convince the soldiers. We have to convince the police to do their job. Another piece of legislation in the UK is Section 38(2), I think, of the Terrorism Act. If somebody has prior knowledge of a terrorism event, and I think we're all agreed that Building 7 was a terrorism event, then they're meant to report it by law, and the BBC didn't do it. So we'll report it to the police for that. But we have to do it in numbers. I mean, just me doing it's not going to help. Just you doing it on your own in New York's not going to help. It has to be done en masse. Because if they don't, I mean, it's a harsh thing to say, but we had a guy done in England, and when I say done, I mean arrested and convicted. He went out one night, he was a student, he got really drunk, and he urinated on a war memorial, which is a terrible thing to do, and he was vilified, and quite rightly so, and I think he got put in prison, and quite rightly so, because it's a dumb thing to do, drunk or otherwise. But if you don't do something about this, honestly, you may as well go piss on the American flag, you may as well go piss on the British flag and every war memorial in town. Because if you don't do anything about this, you are not patriots. You're not patriots. Just sit there and watch Gladiators, whatever crap you watch. You are not patriots. So get down, make the police do their job, give them the evidence because you're obeying the law. But sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, no better words can articulate that sentiment than what you just said. You are totally right. The real patriots are the people like you doing what you're doing. And, what I would recommend is there should be some kind of statement that, the next time that a BBC license fee collector comes to somebody's door, that they can be handed this statement. I mean, we should be having some statement, some webpage that people, British citizens, can visit to print out, to hand to their BBC license fee director, or send it into the BBC and say, I, John Smith, am not paying my license fee because this, and that, and AE 9/11 Truth, and basically we're not going to support terrorism by paying the BBC. And if BBC starts getting that, that's going to, I mean, look at the amount of press that you've gotten, okay? I mean, imagine if people start doing this en masse, and I think, this has a great potential. Your story right here, and you leading the charge here, has a great potential to make a major effect. And I have not seen, and I'm not going to say they don't exist, I haven't seen it mentioned here in the United States, your story in any of our press. And it's because they're afraid of this. They don't, they're afraid of mass movements around 9/11 Truth taking legs, and I like making them afraid, and I want to see this succeed. So yeah, we need a statement. We need to get your words out, and I think that what you just said needs to be a soundbite echoed around the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's a guy called Peter Drew, who's the UK coordinator for architects and engineers. I don't know if you're aware of him, Andy, but I'll certainly give you his email. And he's organising just that at the moment. We're trying to get together some form of almost like a citizens' charter, or some wording that we can send to the BBC. Maybe get some lawyers involved to have a look at it. I mean, I was represented in the court. Well, I had what they call a Mackenzie friend. A Mackenzie friend, I don't know if you have that expression in the States, is a legally aware or a qualified lawyer who's allowed to sit next to you but isn't allowed to say anything. And I had this guy who's a very eminent chap who represents, have I said this before? I've done 2 interviews today, and I'm very, very wary of repeating myself. Represents Imran Khan, who I think is going to run for Prime Minister of Pakistan, and is an eminent cricketer, who was very, very helpful. And he's looking into ways around this strict liability nonsense that you have to pay for the BBC. And once we can find that, and I'm sure there will be a way around it, these people have got problems. They've got real problems, because we will get someone into court where this evidence has to be shown. Now, you have to bear in mind that we've also got a guy in England called Muad'Dib, bless him. I don't know if you've heard of a movie called 7/7 Ripple Effect. But in the UK, it really took off big time on the internet, and that was about the London bombings. There's some speculation in it. It's not all factual. But it was certainly scary enough for the authorities to have him extradited from Ireland, where he lives, put in prison for 150 days during the 7/7 inquest, and then put on trial for attempting to pervert the course of justice. Now, all this guy did was send this DVD, which is an hour long, to a terror trial at a court in London, which was related to the London bombings. It wasn't the London bombings, but friends of the alleged bombers, that said that the British government had set it up, etc., and then these guys were all patsies. The film was shown to a British jury, and this guy was found not guilty. not guilty. I mean, they'd seen this stuff and they thought there's some substance in that. The BBC never reported that. I found it in a tiny little side column in a magazine called Metro, which they hand out free on the Underground. And he was looking at 20 years inside, but he's a very calm, cool guy, is John. And that story never made the BBC. They still have a post on him on their website citing him as some 7/7 conspiracy nut, the usual bullshit they come out with. They're really guilty. I feel dreadful. I used to work for the BBC. I worked for them for a couple of years, and it's so tragic to see what was a fine institution. It really was a fine institution. It was really loved. It was called Auntie. We called it Auntie, this Metaterral sort of sobriquet, where, you trusted it. It was the place to go to for news. But now it's just a shambles. It's an iniquitous, horrible little organisation, and they're full of liars. And I've said this several times now on radio and on film. And if they don't like me calling them liars, well, they can take me to court. Let's go.
You're totally right, and people need to support you. Do you have a website that they can visit right now?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well,
I don't. I mean, I've been using sort of architects and engineers as a little conduit for advertising the case, and I use 9/11 Blogger now and again. But by all means, I mean, I've got a couple of films. The Reasonable Cause is a compilation of shamelessly plagiarized work from the likes of Dylan Avery and co, who I greatly admire. But it does lay out good, if you like, substantial material for why you should withhold your money from the British government, because and mostly of them are mainstream sources, I hasten to add, why we shouldn't be paying them, because we are funding terrorism. So there's a film called Reasonable Cause, which is on YouTube, edited by Tony Rooke, and then Offensive, the story of Tony Farrell. And the law is there. The law is there, but it's just a matter of numbers. It's a matter of numbers. Whilst I admire the 9/11 Truth Movement, I admire all the people who do such great work. Richard Gage wanted to fly over for the court case, but he would have been a little bit superfluous because we had Niels as well. David Ray Griffin. What I'd really like to see, Andy, is, and we've made this offer to the BBC, as I'm sure you've made offers to the American networks, let's get David Ray Griffin in a studio and put him up against one of their guys, and let's see what happens. They tried it in France. They tried it on French national television, and then all of a sudden the French national television guys couldn't turn up.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. That speaks volume.
Well, this hour has passed really fast, and in terms of people wanting to keep track of what you're doing, they can keep track here on 9/11 Freefall, because we're going to keep up on your story, and if there's any new developments, we'll try to get you back on here to talk about that. Tony, I want to thank you for coming on today and for telling your story, and we wish you the best of luck, and you have the support of us here in the United States 9/11 Truth community going stronger and getting bigger every day. You have us behind you.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, folks, that is it. We are out of time. Remember, you can listen to us every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. This is Andy Steele saying have a great night, good week, and God bless.